Hello and welcome to the Micronaut podcast. This is episode 003. I am your host, Sergio del Amo. I am joined today by Iván López. How are you, Iván?
Hello, I'm good.
This is the third episode of the podcast. The Micronaut podcast is a podcast to keep you informed about the Micronaut framework. Micronaut framework, for those new to the podcast, is a framework on the JVM. It allows you to build applications with Java, Groovy, Kotlin, Maven or Gradle for your build tool, and tested with JUnit, Spock, CodeTest. So a build agnostic framework to build any kind of applications from web servers to command line applications. In this third episode, I wanted to talk about database migration tools, which is something that we support. But before going into that, let's cover the agenda. For agenda, I want to remind everyone that we are doing something funny every Tuesday and Thursday. We are streaming live on twitch.tv/MicronautFW. So that's the acronym for Micronaut framework, not Micronaut for the win. And we are building an application from scratch. We have done already, we streamed yesterday I forgot if it was the 8th or the 9th, so more or less 8 hours already. 1 hour each day, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we are building an application from scratch. We are building an application to the typical application that you will use if you wanted to have like a newsletter. So it's an application where people can fill a form and give you their email address. We trigger like a transactional email with a confirmation link, which contains a JWT that we sign using Micronaut security. When we receive the link, we confirm it in the database. We are using Micronaut data JDBC. We are using also, for example, Micronaut views with ThimeLeaf template rendering engine, and essentially a lot of tests, a lot of controllers, a lot of validation. So all the things that you will typically face when you are building a Micronaut application. So if this sounds like your cup of tea, tune in every Tuesday and Thursday. And if you're not able to, we are uploading the videos on demand to our YouTube channel. We don't have a friendly URL for the YouTube channel yet. So for now, visit the Micronaut website and scroll to the footer and you will find a link to YouTube, or just search in YouTube for Micronaut channel. For agenda, in the long-term agenda, Micronaut co-founder Graham Roche has a talk in JFocus, which, let me check the dates. JFocus is in February 2022, from the 7th until the 9th of February, and it's in Stockholm, Sweden. And I think it's an in-person event, which is exciting. And he's doing a talk about building optimized Java microservices with Micronaut 3 and GraalVM. If you are in Sweden, no brainer, and if you are in Europe, that's probably like a conference to consider. jfocus.se is the URL, focus with a K. I will include a link in the show notes to both the talk and the conference. That was a lot of housekeeping for the agenda. Let's go back to Level Up. So Level Up is a section, for those new to the podcast, where we essentially give you a tip about using Micronaut. And one of the things that while doing Micronaut Live that I hit, so the beauty of Micronaut Live, the beauty and the not so beauty is that we are coding live. So you are seeing myself hitting issues, tests that don't pass and I don't know why. And the other day I hit an issue that many of you will probably hit, which is we were using Micronaut JDBC, and we had a test annotated with at Micronaut test. At Micronaut test by default, so the test was more or less the following. We were like adding a user to the database with a service. So I was injecting a singleton in the test, saving a user in the database, and the user is saved like unconfirmed, right? And we were testing we have like a confirmation endpoint, which essentially is like the typical, when you click like in a newsletter, when you subscribe and you receive an email and you click and you go to the website and the website essentially confirms your subscription because you have essentially proven that you own the email address, right? So I was testing that functionality, and what I was doing in the test is I was saving the user, and then I was doing an HTTP request to a Micronaut controller, and the Micronaut controller was essentially like updating the database, and then I was fetching the user from the database and checking that the status has changed, right, as a result of the HTTP request. And that test was failing. I was failing because, if you were not aware of this is like a good tip to have, is by default Micronaut test will wrap all the tests in a transaction and will roll back at the end of the transaction, right? So if you want to test a scenario such as the way that I described, which I think is a normal scenario, right? A scenario where you essentially like fetching information sometimes directly by injecting a singleton and sometimes indirectly by sending an HTTP request. The solution is simple. Is in the Micronaut test annotation, you can say transactional equals false, and that essentially will disable that behavior. So if you are hitting such a scenario and you don't know why, try disabling that behavior, that automatic transaction wrapping, and that may be what you are looking for. Have you hit this issue, Ivan?
No, I haven't, because I don't use Micronaut test too much. Usually in the projects I've worked on, we kind of wire everything manually because we wanted to have more control about when and how we start the application context and embedded servers. So basically, we started what we needed, and then at the end of the test, we deleted everything we created during that test to make sure that we didn't pollute any other tests in the suite.
So if you open like the Micronaut modules themselves, many of them, they don't use Micronaut test. In part, that's because we started those modules before Micronaut test even existed, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot of... So what Micronaut test does, and this is a good point that Ivan mentioned, is Micronaut test by default, if you have like a Micronaut application with a server runtime, such as Netty, right? The default one, Micronaut test will start the server. And sometimes you don't need to start the server for the test, right? So the server start is really fast, and you probably don't see like a much, you will not see like a lot of downgrade performance in terms of development performance. But the same as transactional, you can set transactional to false, you can set start applications equal false, and that essentially will, in a test annotated with a Micronaut test, you will have like the application context. So you could like test, for example, that you can inject a bean. I don't know, you want to test persistence and you just want to inject like a Micronaut data JDBC service, and you want to test like the queries are what you expect them to be, but you don't want to test the controller, or many tests that you may not need to test the HTTP server. You can do that with Micronaut test. Yeah, bear those two in mind. Micronaut test start application false if you don't need the server, and Micronaut test transactional false if you don't need or you don't want the automatic rollback of the transaction. Let's move to the next section, Ivan. For the next section, I wanted to talk to Ivan, and the reason I invited Ivan is because he has done a lot of work in these modules about database migration tools. So we have many persistent solutions in Micronaut. Some of them involve like using Micronaut data, either Hibernate or JDBC. We have a Micronaut SQL module as well. And when you go to Micronaut SQL, there are like, so this is like you want to have persistence. Maybe you want to use Hibernate and JPA without using Micronaut data, or you want to use...
We also support, in Micronaut SQL, we have support for Duke, JDBI, and I think there are other things that we have support in that module. We also include some async drivers as the MySQL and the Postgres. Those were created way before, because now if you want to go to the reactive route to access your database, we have Micronaut R2DBC support in a different module, but that's a different topic.
Many of us, and I include myself, which we have worked with Hibernate in the past, we have delegated sometimes the creation of the database schema to Hibernate, right? Mm-hmm. So essentially, we have mapped our... we have used Hibernate as an ORM, and we have created like entities, and Hibernate has created the schema for us. That's not the best approach. The approach that we recommend and that we try to convince every client to use is use a proper database migration tool where you can define essentially the same as we do with Git, where you have commits and your code is evolving. Have represent with and we'll talk which ways you can use represent how the schema of the database is evolving, and essentially when you run your application, if the database is not up to date, it will apply the necessary changes to the schema, and if it's up to date, it will not, right? So that's what we recommend you to do. And one of the features when you create a new Micronaut application and you select any of the persistence modules, you will see that you have in application.yaml, which is the default configuration, you will see that you have, I think it's data sources, default, db create, I think it is. Let me check it. And we set it by default to create and drop, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we generate an application...
yeah, that's with JDBC, with Micronaut Data JDBC. We try to create the schema for you.
The parameter is called data sources default schema generate. We set it to create drop by default. And what we recommend you to do is explore one of these database migration tools and set data sources default schema generate to none. With that introduction, please, Iván, explain which database migrations tools we support in Micronaut and how people can use them.
Yeah, so we support basically the two main tools out there. I'm not aware if there are more, probably there are more, but the two most used tools are Flyway and Liquibase. And we support them for a long time. And the goal, as Sergio said, is the same. You want to kind of define your schemas as along with your code. So when you create a new entity, instead of delegating that to Microdata JDBC or to Hibernate, you need to create the schema that the database schema that matches your domain entity. And with that approach, what you can do is basically evolving your schema as your application grows. So if you need to add a new field in the future, you need to write a small migration saying, I want to add this field to this table, and if this is the type I want, I allow nulls or I don't allow nulls, and you commit that in your Git repository with your code. So with that approach, if you deploy that to production and you already have the database created because you have been running that for some time, that new schema will be, or that update to the schema will be applied, and you will have the new field that you need. And this is nice because it allows you to evolve your schema as the same as your code. Because the nice thing about these tools is that without this approach, what you will need to do is basically connect directly to the SQL database and manually alter database, alter table, add column, remove column, those kind of nonsense that you probably don't have access to production, right? And it can be prone to error, and you can fail, and a lot of things can go wrong. So both tools are pretty much the same. You define the main difference, I think, is that for Flyway, you define your migrations with SQL. So you need to follow a pattern on the name of the file. So Flyway knows when to apply a migration and how to do it, and then it basically executes your raw SQL. And with Liquibase, you have different formats. The one I've used the most is XML, because the nice thing about it is that you have fully support in your IDE. So if you don't know how to do anything, basically you hit out control space and you have auto completion about adding a column, removing, and do everything you want. So I'm not really sure if you can write plain SQL, but this XML thing is pretty simple to use, and there is a lot of documentation out there for it, and it explains with examples how to do a lot of things. So it's pretty simple to use.
With Liquibase, I think you can write like more complex queries, within the XML. You can say you are for example. adding a column that cannot be null and you need like to populate that column with some value. You can do things like that. And both tools, they are pretty cool in the sense that you can write like typically like the change, describing the change that you do to the column, but you can also like write the rollback. And you can also test locally. You can like run the migration locally or even simulate the migration and see the changes to the database. So for me, it's like essentially like a no-brainer. If you are like using a relational database with Micronaut, you have to use any of these two tools to essentially manage your migrations. How will people install these tools in a Micronaut applications?
So if you already have your Micronaut application, basically it's a matter of adding a dependency. Either IO Micronaut Liquibase, or IO Micronaut Flyway. It's just one dependency. And by default, once you add them, they are enabled by default and they look for the default data source. So you don't need to do anything. Just add the dependency and they are there, they are enabled. And the only thing you need to do is if you don't use the default directories to put your migrations on, you need to change that. We explained that in the docs. And if not, just drop your migration files to the appropriate directories. And that's it. You restart your application, Micronaut detects that, and the tools apply the migration to your database.
Yeah, so essentially we have features also in Micronaut Launch. So we have this website called which you can reach if you go to launch.micronaut.io, which is essentially like a web application that you can have like select features, and it will be essentially created like a Micronaut application for you, and it will download a zip folder with the Micronaut application. We have features for both. So essentially, if you search in features for either Flyway or Liquibase, you will see that it adds the dependency that Iván was mentioning. So you will have the migrations under source main resources, right? I think there is like, as you said, like a convention for like the way you name things with Flyway. In configuration, you can like, do you have to enable it, or in the moment you add the dependency, it's enabled?
It's enabled by default.
In the moment you add the dependency.
Yeah.
You can, there are like, in all the modules, and this is a good reminder for anyone, when you go to docs.micronaut.io and you go to either Flyway or Liquibase, you will find the documentation. On the top, there is like another link called configuration reference, where you will find like all the configuration options that you have at your disposal. If you, as Iván was saying, if you need like to change the default path where your migrations are stored or any of those things, you can configure that. And how will people know that the migrations have been run when they start their application?
So basically, if you have a type or something went wrong, it will fail and you will see a huge stack trace. But if everything works and the application ran without any problem, and you want to make sure that not make sure, but imagine that you have been running this in production for a year and you have applied a lot of migrations and you want to make sure which is the database status for something, right? So we also expose, if you are using Micronaut management endpoints, we contribute to those endpoints in either module. So you have a new endpoint called Liquibase or Flyway, and that in those endpoints we expose the migrations that have been run. So you have all the information, the date, the IDs, the status, everything, right? So you can check that, and you will have all the information.
As Iván said, if you want to have like these endpoints, if you are new to endpoints in Micronaut, these are like similar to the health endpoint that you probably have used in other frameworks. You will have to add the management dependency. If you are using Micronaut Launch, search for the management feature. And it will be something like endpoints.liquibase enable true, I think. And that will enable the endpoint. For all the endpoints, we have another flag typically called sensitivity, which will essentially limit the detail exposed by the endpoint. And if you are using Micronaut security, check the Micronaut security documentation, because you will find instructions about how essentially to customize if you want to secure that endpoint to a particular role, so that only some users are able to see the information exposed at that endpoint. You can do that. And I think that's pretty much it, right, Ivan?
Yeah, one other thing we do support for both tools is GraalVM. So if you are using GraalVM, you can totally use both Liquibase or Flyway. We support GraalVM since Micronaut 2 for both tools. So with Liquibase, you don't need to do anything. It's out of the box. It will work. And with Flyway, it's the same unless you decided to change the default directory for your migrations, because as the migrations are pre-compute, when you build your native image, we need to know those paths to look for the migration. So if we look for the default path, but if you change that, you need to tell us when you build the native image. There are instructions on the docs about how to do it, but yeah, they work without any problem.
This is one of the integrations with GraalVM where we have done some work on our side to essentially whitelist all those static resources, right?
Yeah, we do have, especially for the Flyway module, because it was more tricky, we do a few things to integrate with Flyway, which is not so it's not straightforward to integrate your tool or your framework or basically anything, your plain Java application with Flyway. I have open issues in both repositories asking for official GraalVM support, because that way we framework maintainers don't need to do anything, and every user of the tools, not only our Micronaut users, will benefit from this. But in both cases, the answer has been we probably will add this support in the future, but we are not sure if we can do it yet. We cannot commit to maintain this yet. So
yeah.
You need to basically, if you use Micronaut, you don't have any problems. We take care of that, and we make sure it works. And when we upgrade the versions of Flyway and Liquibase, we make sure that they also work with GraalVM, and if not, we fix it. So you don't need to worry about it.
Going back to episode 1, in episode 1 we talk about the GraalVM test suite, and Ivan has a test application for both Flyway and Liquibase.
Exactly.
The last thing that I think we have to mention about our integration with Flyway and Liquibase is we support events for both modules, and this is something that we have in many modules. So if you want, you can subscribe to, in another episode we should probably talk about events, but essentially you can subscribe to like an event to see when the migration finished or when the schema was cleaned. So you can create like event listeners and subscribe to those events if you need, for whatever reason, to have more like an audit in your logs. You can absolutely do that. I think that's pretty much everything people need to know about to get started with either module, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Let me thank our sponsors. This episode is possible by the Micronaut Foundation sponsors. We have two sponsors, two corporate sponsors right now. We have OJ Computing, which is our ambassador sponsor, and we have Safri.net, which is our bronze sponsors. Thanks a lot to both of them, because they make this podcast possible. And also thanks for all the community sponsors. I will include a link in the show note if in case you are interested. And thanks to Corbin and Bach, Gis Loinsick, Lucas Moravet, Jen Weiss, Jeff Scott Brown, Danilo Marquez, Edgar Rios Navarro, Goran Erson, Andrew McKee, Balao Subranian, Regas Sami, Philip Eisenbach, Hassan Muhyiddin, and Jason Siller. My God, are the names complicated? Thanks to all of you. And let me jump to the last section, which is guides and content. Guides and content is a section where we point you to new things that have been published to the Micronaut ecosystem. And I mentioned already in the agenda section that we are publishing all the Micronaut Live videos to the YouTube channel. We have a new YouTube channel, so please go there and subscribe, because we have a lot of content already, because we had a lot of content before in the Object Computing YouTube channel, and we migrated part of that content here. So if you want to consume Micronaut content in video format, we have plenty of content there. I wanted to mention a couple of guides. We have published a guide about Java records, which is a pretty exciting feature that you can, if you are working with JDK 17, the latest LTS JDK version, you can use Java records, and in the guide we feature so Java records for those new to Java records, and it's not that I have a lot of experience with Java records myself either. It reduces a lot of the boilerplate for POJOs in Java. So typically where you had a POJO with final fields, with getters and equals and hash code and a constructor, right? Some languages in the JVM, such as Groovy, already like simplify how you will route those POJOs. Coldit has a similar concept with data classes. And this is like the Java official way of doing these immutable objects, these like kind of DTOs. And for building Micronaut applications, they fit perfectly because there are many places where you want immutable DTOs. And in the guide, we saw a couple. We saw, for example, how to use Java records for immutable configurations. So we apply a Java record to a class annotated with that configuration properties. We saw how to use Java records for a mapped entity. We support using Java records for mapped entities with Micronaut data JDBC. So you can have like a really succinct representation of your database entities. And we support also Java records, and we saw in the guide to do projections. So when you are using Micronaut data JDBC, you often do projections from the database where you essentially fetch a couple of columns from the database and instantiate a new object. And this is like a perfect way of a perfect usage of Java records, because these are like essentially like pure data transfer objects. And the latest use case that we saw in the guide is using a Java record for an object that you want to render as JSON. Actually, the whole guide doesn't use any normal DTOs. It uses Java records for almost everything. And I think this is going to change a lot of APIs and the way that people write Java applications. Check the guide. Let us know what you think, because I think if you are in the position to use JDK 17, this is a feature worth of the upgrade. The other guide that I wanted to mention is we are publishing guides about Liquibase and Flyway migration. So check them out as well, which are quite in line with the episode of the podcast. And I don't have anything else, Ivan. Do you want to add anything about anything?
No, yes, as Sergio said, check the guides. Java records are really nice, and it's a new way to create your POJOs when you need those to be mutable, and you reduce a lot of the code. So yeah, check the guides. They're very good. So thanks everyone for listening to the podcast. We see each other in 2 weeks. Keep using Micronaut and keep building nice applications. Thanks everyone. Thank you.